Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more of Warhammer Fantasy lore, where today we are going to have a look at, well, kind of a part of the Empire, and also kind of not a part of the Empire. The free city-state of Marienburg. Now, there's not a whole lot of free cities in the Warhammer world. There are exceptionally few, especially in the old world, as Marienburg is in essence surrounded by various superpowers that have, at one point or another, been interested in acquiring Marienburg's territory and its incredibly strategic position at the very mouth of the River Reich. Its positioning has led it to be an enormously potent trade center, with dozens upon dozens of ships passing in and out of its vast, complex port networks every single day. Unfathomable wealth is generated in this free city, and yet it is not claimed by the Empire. It is not claimed by Bretonia. It is not claimed by the various barbarian tribes further to the north, and yet all of them, and other creatures as well, have at one point or another attempted to lay claim to the city. Indeed, its earliest occupants weren't even human, as the history of Marienburg starts long before the rise of Sigmar and the start of the Imperial calendar. The very earliest sign of civilization in what would eventually become Marienburg were the elves. The high elves of Ulthuan had spread across much of the old world during the height of their power. And as Ulthuan itself was of course an island, the very first places they would settle were on the coasts, constructing fortresses and dockyards to service the high elf fleets, and to facilitate expeditions deeper into the then unknown territories of the old world. And so it was with Marienburg, where a significantly sized elfin fortress was constructed on the largest island leading in to the River Reich. These days, this island is called Rieke's Island, and it was the first area settled. However, after the War of Vengeance, the elves largely abandoned the old world. They would maintain a few coastal settlements here and there, but what would eventually become Marienburg was not one of these settlements. Instead, the area was largely abandoned and eventually inhabited by less hospitable creatures than the elves, the Fimir. We have talked about them before. They used to be actually a rather significant force in the Warhammer world, but that was a very long time ago. And these days, the remnants of the once great Fimir civilization, heavy quotation marks there on civilization, can usually be found deep in swamps. They are raiders and bandits, occasionally striking out against human villages and fortresses, but rarely anything beyond that. However, before the beginning even of the Imperial calendar, the area around Marienburg, consisting of vast fens and dozens of islands varying in size, was the perfect location for a major Fimir settlement. And as the territory was hardly hospitable to human beings, they were allowed to live their lives largely in isolation, striking out against other neighboring tribes or humans. However, the humans were eventually given no choice. A couple of decades before the beginning of the Imperial calendar, one of the human tribes that had been on the losing side of the countless tribal wars between various human groupings in what is now the Empire, were chased into the Fenland. This tribe were the Jutons, They had been defeated and ousted by the far more successful Teutogens, who would of course also eventually go on to found the Grand Duchies of Midland and Middenheim. But that too still was a very, very long time in the future. For now, the Jotun needed a new homeland, and whilst the Fens certainly was not an ideal place to live, it was better than getting eradicated by the Teutogens. And so they entered into a series of wars with the Fimir, first to secure their own existence, and then to continue to expand into the Fenlands. As the harsh territory did not exactly provide easy living, the Jotun required ever larger areas to support their population, and preferably access to the coastlines and the fishing resources of the Sea of Claws. The countless tribal skirmishes between the Jotun and the Fimir would eventually come to a climactic head amongst the ruins of the abandoned Elven settlements on the coast, where the Jotun had finally managed to track down the Fimir Queen, the heart of Fimir society. Once she was slain, the Fimir would be forced to scatter, leaderless and deprived of the ability to replenish their ranks. The battle was costly for the Jotun, but eventually they emerged victorious, their enemy's queen slain, and their hordes vanquished. Now at long last secure, the Jutuns declared their own kingdom, Jutonsirik, which would naturally be ruled over by their king, Marius, which would of course also provide the roots for the city's eventual name. And the Jotuns would be left pretty much alone for the next 500 years, because, well, they didn't really possess anything of any value. The realms of Jutonsirik were marshes, bogs, fens, and swamps. It really didn't have much to offer anyone, frankly. The greatest wealth that Jutonsirik had to offer was fish. As well, there wasn't a whole lot of international trade flowing down the mouth of the River Reich at that point. But eventually, of course, the tribes of the Empire united under the rule first of Sigmar Heldenhammer, and then eventually his many successors. One of the more successful ones, who thus ran out of lands to conquer, was Sigismund II, remembered after his death as Sigismund the Conqueror, as not only did he take a piece of Bretonia and establish holdings within today's border princes and the city of Lichtenberg, but he also, of course, invaded Jutonsirik, or as the men of the Empire knew it at the time, the Wastelands. Like I said, there really wasn't a whole lot of things of value there. But Sigismund II saw the opportunities that could be offered with access to the ocean and potential future conquest for his successors. Now, in reality, his actual follow-on, Siegfried the Lawgiver, would prove to be nowhere near as cantankerous as Sigismund. But by then, of course, it was far too late for Jutonsirik, which had been wiped off the map and replaced with the Imperial province of Westerland. And it wasn't really all that bad of a deal for the inhabitants of ex-Jutonsirik either. Now, with access to the Empire and its significantly larger market, suddenly Marienburg's primary produce, fish, became super duper valuable. The empire was growing. With no more lands to conquer, no more wars to wage, all the empire's energy was focused inwards, and towns, villages, and settlements all over the place popped up and grew exponentially. There were even further attempts to colonize the fens and marshes surrounding Marienburg, with varying degrees of success, but the point is, the empire needed a lot more food, and Marienburg had always been able to pull enormous quantities of the sea's treasure directly from its watery depths. This did immediately present another challenge, however, as fish is not the safest of foodstuffs once it's been left outside in the sun for a day or two. However, luckily for Marienburg, the sea provided yet another solution: salt. By dunking their fish in this magical substance, they were able to store the fish and keep them healthy and edible for an extended period of time, allowing the bounty of the ocean to flow into the empire and feed the hungry bellies of countless citizens. And even better, the empire swiftly developed quite a taste for salt. Soon, salt became a far more important export for Marienburg than fish could ever hope to be. After all, the empire now commanded enormous areas of land. They could grow as much food as they desired, they just needed to grow enough people and till enough soil to support the population. Once that had begun, the luxury produce that was salt became infinitely more desirable. And with the wealth of the inland empire also growing, now that they had plentiful access to food and were now seeking out more and more local specialties to form a luxury trade, the money flew into Marienburg in a veritable river, with the Baron of Westerland becoming one of the richest individuals in the entire empire. Unfortunately for him, however, his riches were entirely based on the ocean, which now also directly connected him to an ever-increasing number of pirates, bandits, murderers, and Norscans. This would lead to the very first sacking of Marienburg in 632, where the Norscan longships struck the port city and burned the majority of it. This wasn't the first time that Marienburg had been burnt, of course. The elves had abandoned and pretty much set fire to their old holdings. Then the Jotuns had arrived and burned the Fimir's shacks and kicked them out, so this was merely the first time that the city called Marienburg had been burnt. Not the first time that that particular spot had been razed to the ground, and nor would it be the last. Now, many people would feel a pinch dejected after having all of their shit torched, but not the Marienburgians. The Westlandrians? I don't even know what to call them, honestly. The people of Marienburg. Instead, they set about researching and studying the technology of their attackers. The Norscans had come from across the sea, a significant distance, and the Marienburgers didn't have any kind of ships capable of crossing that amount of open water. Their greatest vessel were coastal fishing boats, used to the relatively gentle conditions of the mouth of the River Reich. If they were ever to head out into the Sea of Claws, it would only be during times of extreme desperation, when they needed to try and fish further afield, and even then their odds of returning would not be great. And as for actually crossing the sea and heading to Norsca, that would simply not be happening. Partially due to the maritime challenges of crossing a large body of water, storms, etc., and also because, well, the Sea of Claws is not named that for nothing. So they set about attempting to replicate the boating technology of their invaders. Their success in doing so was mixed, to put it mildly. The next time the Norscans invaded, the Marienburgers did not put up much in the way of resistance. Not the next time either, but eventually they began developing their own effective navy. They began meeting the invaders more and more often out to sea, and whilst they still got their ass kicked more often than not, they began scoring victories. Marienburg was no longer quite so easy a target. The Norscans had to launch ever larger and more determined raids to hit the city. Overcoming Marienburg's navy, of course, also was but the first step. Attacking the city itself, which grew more and more fortified over the years, well, it was all starting to feel like it wasn't quite worth it. The Marienburgers saw this as an opportunity. When the Norscans defeated them to sea, then the Baron of Marienburg would offer enormous ransoms, gathered from the hoards of his own personal palace, the earnings of enormous quantities of trade with the Empire. This would usually be more than enough to have the Norscans turn about, fully satisfied in their plunder without the need to throw themselves at an ever more fortified city. And on occasion, when the Marienburgers were victorious against the raiders, well, sometimes they killed all of them. Of course. Sometimes they tortured them to death and paraded them through the city. I mean, you did burn their houses, so what can you expect? But sometimes the Baron of Marienburg realized that there was an opportunity here. These Norscans were clearly coming from far afield. They were wearing strange armor, often superior to that found within the Empire. Their weapons, too, were devilishly sharp, and they wore fine furs. Perhaps the Norscans did not necessarily need to be the Marienburgers' enemies. Perhaps they could be their trading partners. They started sending the Norscans back with little gifts, with little trinkets. And as part of their settlements for leaving the city alone, they would also engage in trade deals. They would offer the Norscans a period of preferential treatment at Marienburg's markets. They would offer them fantastic rates for the fine furs and the forged swords of Norsca. Now, of course, for the Norscans, raiding is a way of life. It isn't just something they do out of necessity, although that is a big part of it. They also do it for their gods, as a part of their worship and religion. However, if enormous wealth and fine southern goods could be acquired with only a single ship, dispatched laden down with furs and swords, instead of needing to go through all of the bother of organizing an entire invasion armada, well, there were other enemies closer to home to fight for the gods. With the stroke of a pen, Marienburg had turned its greatest enemy and threat from a foe to a friend. And with the acquisition of this new friend, Marienburg also gained access to highly skilled Norscan shipwrights and the ability to create larger, more durable vessels. Marienburg became the center for the Empire's exploration of the coasts surrounding its borders, sailing south down the coast of Bretonnia, sailing northwards to visit the Norscans directly, and beginning to open trade routes with other powers. Over the next 1,000-odd years, they would even reach distant lands such as Araby and the Kingdom of Ind, bringing back enormous wealth to the city. This was going to cause some problems, however. See, initially, Marienburg nobility had to well, simply just be more or less normal people. The chieftain of Marius's town weren't really separated from the common men by much, other than perhaps owning 2 or 3 fishing vessels. This had been a tradition that had largely been maintained through the city's early rise. The nobility had a monopoly on the production of salt, which of course gained them tremendous riches, but their coffers were frequently emptied as well, by building new warships, by levying ever greater numbers of men-at-arms, by paying off the Norscans. Not too much wealth was ever allowed to truly settle into their coffers, but now the quantity of gold flowing into Marienburg was of such an absurd, obscene quantity that practically no expenditure could ever fully stem the tide. This inevitably meant that men of lesser caliber would rise to prominence. The nobles initially held the monopoly over the trade, but as they grew ever richer and ever more opulent and indulgent, they started to cede small portions of their family's trades to lesser men, giving the privilege of running an area of the docks to an entrepreneuring individual, until eventually the majority of trade in Marienburg was overseen by nobles, sure, but ran by commoners and merchants. Now, for the time being, their monetary might was not able to translate effectively into political power. The nobles had too much authority. Even if one would take up an enormous loan with a merchant house, well, so long as the nobles maintained monopoly on force via levying men-at-arms, soldiers, what was the merchant house going to do? Demand repayment? Nah, that's not how that works. This status quo would continue until around about 1547 in the Imperial calendar, when the Civil War broke out. The age of the 3 emperors, as this period of nearly 500 years would later become known as. A period of tremendous internal strife within the empire. Enormous power struggles between various individuals claiming the right to sit the throne of Altdorf. Marienburg's ability to raise tremendous quantities of capital was now more valued than ever, and nobles and would-be emperors from all over the lands would travel to Marienburg to plead for the merchant houses and the nobility's favor. Now, the nobles of Marienburg no longer possessed a monopoly of force because the merchants could call in favors not just from Marienburg nobility, but the force of arms of outside powers. Oh, mighty Prince of Middenland, you wish to become emperor? That's an expensive endeavor. Perhaps we could help you with that, but if we do, you're gonna have to come and fix a little bit of an issue in our own backyard. See, this silly local noble hasn't been paying his debts. This only, of course, led to even more power, even more wealth being hoarded by the merchant class. And they would be given yet another enormous gift-wrapped opportunity when Marienburg's only true competition when it came to world-spanning trade, the High Elves, decided that it would be better to sign a treaty with the humans than attempt to block them out of the markets, as no matter how many of their ships the High Elves accidentally sank, the humans just kind of kept coming. So, not wanting to bother anymore, the High Elves signed a treaty with Marienburg, the so-called Treaty of Amity and Commerce, allowing the elves and the humans to cooperate, allowing Marienburg even greater access not only to the markets of the world, but to Ulthuan. A market of such ridiculous wealth and opulence as to make every other mercantile conquest of the city's history seem insignificant by comparison. It wasn't long until the merchant class were sitting in on the Baron's High Council, dictating decisions almost, if not in fact more so, than the nobles. Although, with increasing wealth comes ever-mounting greed, and that does on occasion tend to have some drawbacks. As not all of the wealth flowing into Marienburg was entirely legal. See, it's all well and good to buy and sell at a profit, sure, but you know what's even better? Buying and selling at an enormous profit via, for example, goods acquired at a steep discount. A discount acquired at the edge of an axe. As the Norscan raiders that had once been attacking Marienburg to steal its treasure wasn't just bringing homemade goods anymore. They realized that many of the less scrupulous Marienburg merchants wouldn't ask exactly where they got all of their fancy goods from. Which led to Marienburg becoming an enormous center for pirates. One could even go so far indeed as to say that at one point, the majority of the Empire's navy, quote-unquote, were basically just pirates. As the Empire, being a largely landlocked nation with not a whole lot of interest of venturing into the sea, has never bothered particularly much about building up a proper naval force. At the very least, not anything beyond discouraging Norscan or Bretonnian raiders, as Bretonnia too has, on occasion, seen opportunities to acquire booty from their neighboring nations, especially during often plentiful periods of open warfare between Bretonnia and the Empire. But whilst pirates are all well and good when they're bringing your booty back, sometimes piracy and theft in general does not pay. One such incident happened on the year 2344, when a particularly ambitious pirate managed to find a way to Ulthuan. Now, this is deeply suspicious, by the way, extraordinarily so, because Ulthuan is protected not merely by the Sea Lords and constantly patrolling fleets of high elven vessels, capable of moving at tremendous speed and seeing through the magical fog that protects the island, but also by flyers, by great eagles, on occasion even dragons, and did I mention the magical mist that covers the entire island? Yeah, Ulthuan's not the kind of place you just happen upon. And yet that was exactly, supposedly, what happened for the famous Red Pirate of Marienburg, one Otto Steinroth. Now, I don't believe that for a single solitary instance. Not a one. Not a moment, in fact. I suspect either A, he was let through by some force malicious to Ulthuan. The Dark Elves come to mind. They've been messing with the High Elves quite frequently, and considering the Elves' reaction, this would do far more than simply raid a coastal village or two. Alternatively, I wouldn't be surprised either if the hero of the day, Sea Lord Aislinn, might have had a little bit more to do with all of this than he lets on. Now we're entering conspiracy theory realms here, but a significant pirate fleet breaches all of Ulthuan's defenses that just so happens to be in the area under Sea Lord Aislinn's command. Then the Sea Lord is tragically too late to stop the pirates from sacking several villages. Oh no, How tragic. Then the pirates leave, again finding their way out of the fogs of Ulthuan, and Aeslin decides to not overtake and attack the pirates on the high sea, where his own ships and sea guard would have an enormous, insurmountable advantage over the pirates. They could immediately bring them to justice and seize all of the stolen property. It would be like taking candy from children to do this. No. Aeslin instead decides to follow the pirates all the way back to their birth at Marienburg, of course, and then attack the entire city. Now, I just want to point out something here. Marienburg is ludicrously heavily defended, absurdly so. It has huge curtain walls on both landward sides. The various islands that make up Marienburg all have their own fortified towers, all have their own bastions of artillery, of guards. To even get into Marienburg, you have to pass Riker's Island, dominated by its own enormous fortress, and multiple gun towers on every side. Sailing in here isn't just like entering any old hornet's nest. It's like entering probably the single densest hornet's nest in the old world. Not to mention, one of the most heavily defended in terms of garrison and in terms of experienced gunners as well. This is a very strange decision that Aeslin is taking here. Now, of course, the Sea Guard of Ulthuan are extraordinarily skilled. They summoned up a magic fog to cover the sight of the gunners, and then stormed into the port area, where they started attacking everyone. Aeslin also decided to not tell the powers that be in Marienburg what he was doing there, and the worst part is, if he had sent in a messenger ship and demanded an audience with the Baron and went, okay, listen here, these guys attacked our settlements, we want them all punished, we want all of our stuff back immediately, or we will consider you to be in violation of our treaties. They would have been turned over on a silver platter with apples in their mouths and asparaguses up their arseholes. But no. Aeslin attacked the entire city, engaging in running battles with the Marienburg state troopers, with the garrison, with other pirates that had no idea what the hell was happening. The Lothlorian Sea Guard pushed further in to seize the pirates' vessels, executing the pirates themselves and also killing Otto Steinroth, who fell at Aeslin's own blade in a personal duel. After which, when they recovered all of the stolen goods, the elves moved on to raid Elftown, the special quartered part of Marienburg where high elves are allowed to live, high elf merchants. These were all, in essence, abducted, because Aeslin understood that after what he had done, no pointy ears would be allowed to remain on their heads in Marienburg after this. Then, upon retreating, he turned around and ordered his mages to set an enormous firestorm raging in the Marienburg ports, burning down practically the entirety of their trade navy and vast sections of the merchant district and the port districts as well. High Elven diplomacy. It's almost as bad as Eldar diplomacy, but at least the High Elves get something done whilst engaging with it. Aeslin, when he returned to Ulthuan, of course, was utterly lambasted and crucified for these absurd actions. He had, in essence, declared war on an allied power. And, for all intents and purposes, practically voided the trade treaties that they had entered into with Marienburg. And Marienburg was no longer some tiny competitive manling town. It was now the single largest trade center in the old world. Suffice to say, Aislin's political standing was reduced to, in essence, absolutely nothing afterwards, and it's a mild miracle he wasn't executed or exiled for his straight-up crimes. However, it did bring him to the attention of the Phoenix King, who had himself been trying to carry out various campaigns against dark elf raiders that had been plaguing Ulthuan for quite some time. The elves had also felt that they were no longer commanding the kind of respect that they truly and really should from the natives of the old world. One might therefore hypothesize that an up-and-coming Sea Lord in search of advancement, his best bet would be to pick on a relatively unprepared target, not a black ark or anything, and bring home not just the booty of such a raid, but the glory of having revenged a great crime against Ulthuan's populace. Again, we're getting a little bit conspiratorial here, but there were an awful lot of things that worked out in very specific and very weird ways during this event, which, incidentally, would be the second sack of Marienburg. And this wasn't the only disaster going on at the time either. See, the Great War Against Chaos had started just some 40-odd years before. During this war, the Baron of Marienburg and Westland, Paulus van der Markt, had been killed. And he'd failed to produce an heir. Whoopsie. This normally would then mean that the position of Baron would pass on to whoever had a hereditary claim, or anyone who had a sufficiently energetic landed claim. Obviously, Middenheim wanted the city, Talabecland and Nordland as well forwarded claims to the Imperial court, now under the rule of Magnus the Pious. Now, this was complicated enough because this was a pretty damn significant tract of territory, and oh, that's right, the single most profitable trade port in the entire empire, if not the entire old world. Yeah. Whoever received this prize would massively upend the power balance within the empire. It would be not ideal at all to give it to any established family. Ideally, it would be great if some lesser nobility could be given control over Marienburg, some outcast noble family or distant relations. And there were certainly plenty of beggars and countless suitors of varying stations claiming to be just that. Long-lost family, third sons, etc., all claiming to have a legitimate claim to Marienburg. The document forgers were doing very fine business at that time, I guarantee you. And initially, Magnus was thrilled. He didn't really care if any of these people had a legitimate claim, not really. If he could pawn the city off to somebody who could simply be an obedient member of the Empire, somebody who could maintain Westland, then that would be ideal, but the problem was there were so goddamn many of them. The sheer quantity of applicants cast into doubt any claim put forward. Okay, so you're the 50th grandson of the grand-grand-granddaughter of the great baron's familial aunt's side, or whatever. We've got 7 of those. Which one are you? And it would make it very difficult to refuse the claims of Talabheland, of Nordland, etc., because they actually could trace their lineage far more accurately so than some random person who paid a few crowns for a street artist to draw up a family tree. There was no easy way to get everybody to be satisfied with any decision here, and the Empire, just having finished fighting a massive war against chaos, was not in a great position right now. Magnus the Pious had of course won great acclaim on the battlefield, and did enjoy a fair degree of popularity, but popularity won abroad rarely translates into long-term popularity at home. And Magnus was worried that the potential riches of Marienburg could lead to a major split within the Empire. That is when a very generous offer was made from the burghers of Marienburg. An alliance of the wealthiest merchant houses came forward to offer a temporary solution. The merchants would take over the running of Marienburg. For now, of course, taxes would still be raised from amongst the populace. All tariffs would be offered up to the Empire, as always. The Imperial garrison would remain, and Marienburg would in no way be removed from the Emperor's purview. No. It would simply be managed by an interim government of merchants, a directorate, yes. It was not a government even per se. It was merely just a financial system to keep the city running smoothly until Magnus could find a proper heir for the city. Naturally. Magnus, smelling a rat, or several, was not entirely inclined to accept the good, patriotic merchants and burghers' offer, but he really didn't have a whole lot of options. He understood that if he did this, he would in essence be signing Marienburg away from the Empire. It might take a year, it might take a decade, it might even take a century, but the moment merchants whose only interest is ever in increasing their money and their power got a hold of relative independence, that would be the end of Marienburg. Weighing the risk of losing the richest city in the Empire against the very real potential risk of a full-blown civil war breaking out again, Magnus decided to go with the former. At least that way, the problem would be shoved further down the line, and Marienburg could always be reintegrated properly into the Empire later on when a suitable candidate re-emerged. Not that the merchant class was intending to give the Empire that sort of time, however. Oh no, not at all. As once they were given a de facto self-governmentship, they immediately set about trying to find ways to reinforce their position. The very first request was, of course, oh my heavens, we keep getting attacked by raiders. There are pirates running amok everywhere. There are Norscans. There are evil elves attacking us. For no particular reason, burning down our dockyards. We have to defend ourselves against these continuous aggressions. Obviously, we can't rely on the Empire to provide all of the force of arms that is required to do this. We understand the Empire is, overburdened as it is, rebuilding from the war, etc. Don't worry. We will take our own safety into our own hands. It is but our patriotic duty to do so. And thus, the license to raise private armies was granted to the merchant guilds. And, in their defense, they were effective. They did their jobs, and after demonstrating for several years that they weren't plotting any uprisings or anything, and proving as well that they could maintain peace and stability within Marienburg and deal with the pirates, well, the Empire figured that it didn't need to station troops in Marienburg anymore, and they always needed soldiers elsewhere. The Empire is never an entirely stable place. In fact, the majority of the Empire is basically untamed wilderness, deep woods and forests that house innumerable war bands of beastmen and cultists, so you really don't want to station a couple thousand soldiers in a city if you don't have to. Obviously, now that the right to bear arms was permanent, the next one was the right to a navy. Generously, the Marienburg merchants yet again extended a hand in peace and friendship to the Empire. Oh, we see, yet again, the burdens of protecting us all weigh heavily upon you, beloved Emperor Leopold. It tears our heart to see you suffer so. Perhaps we could take over the maintenance cost of your fleet. Maybe that would help you. Surely that would be beneficial to us all. And besides, we're the only ones who really, use it anyways. So don't you worry about that. We'll all take care of it. And so, now suddenly the burghers and the merchantmen not only had an army, but a navy as well. The only thing left, of course, was to start running their own local government. Now, in essence, they were already doing that. They had law enforcement in their hands. They still basically made their own laws, but they weren't gathering their own taxes yet. That was still the duty of the Imperial tax collectors, but, sometimes they get it wrong. They don't account for everything. They miss things, they miss shipments, and they're just not that energetic in cracking down on smugglers, on thieves, of the various countless scum and scoundrels that infest such a wealthy city. Oh, no, sir. Leave it to us, the natives. We know all of their tricks. We will see your income rise tremendously, and what do you know? It did. Occasionally through less than wholesome means, sure, but revenue increased. Until the Empire yet again decided, okay, well, you're doing such a great bang-up job about it, just keep doing it. And so now Marienburg had an army, Marienburg had a navy, and Marienburg had a government, with complete control over the taxes, and occasionally some money would go missing here and there as well, to prepare nice and fat coffers for when the opportunity arrived. And, inevitably, it eventually did. Under the reign of Wilhelm the Wise, a prince of Altdorf, and a member of Karl Franz's own dynasty, Marienburg declared independence whilst the Empire was busy waging war on its borders. Of course, attempts were made to retake the city. No less than 3 armies were dispatched at 3 separate occasions to bring the wayward foal back into the flock. But again, as we've already talked about with the elves, Marienburg has been fortified to the point of absurdity. It not only has curtain walls, countless of them, internal bastions, gun towers, fortresses upon fortresses, it's got fortresses defending its fortresses. Literally, the curtain walls have fortresses outside of them that can be protected both by the walls and make it impossible for any attacker to lay siege directly to the city. And as for starving it out, it's the largest port in the old world. And you sold them your navy. Yeah. No, you're not taking Marienburg anytime soon. Each and every one of the Imperial armies was defeated. Quite handily so, frankly. I mean, it's hardly a surprise, really. The merchants have been building up their own private army for ages now, specifically with the intent of seceding from the Empire. They have complete naval dominance and could actually screw with the Empire even more if they decided to simply start cutting off the River Reich, just for shits and giggles. Not to mention, they also still have the treaties with the Elves, and the Elven treaty, I remind you, is with Marienburg, not the Empire. Thus, if Marienburg is under threat, they can still call on the Sea Elves to come help them out. Realizing, after a fair few years of trying, that there was no bringing Marienburg back to the Empire, eventually its official secession was signed into law. Marienburg would become a free city-state outside of the influence of the Empire, and in return, the Empire would be allowed to still operate within Marienburg. It would still be allowed to berth its ships there and take advantage of its enormous mercantile infrastructure. It wasn't an ideal end by any stretch of the imagination, but having allowed things to go as far and as poorly as they had, it was as good as it was going to get. These days, in the modern times of the old world, Marienburg is ruled over by a series of various conclaves, gatherings and bureaucratic councils, shall we say, mostly made up of merchantmen, local politicians, luminaries, and the occasional noble, as well as some representatives of the clergy. Obviously, Manan, the god of the sea, stands tall and strong in Marienburg, where the majority of the populace makes a living, well, off the ocean, either via the trade it brings or via the generation of salt, or still simply fish to feed the hungry populace. A populace that has probably seen better times, as the new Marienburgian rulers are somewhat oppressive, to say the least. Marienburg honestly values foreigners more so than locals these days, having built countless foreign quarters for them to settle in. The official language of Marienburg, well, was once Reichsspiel. It isn't really anymore. It's whatever is spoken in the area you are in, be that Chilean or Brettonian or Reichsspiel or Arabian indeed. And equally so, the law is decided by whoever holds the most economic sway in the area. The richest merchantmen are, for all intents and purposes, above the law because they are the law. They're the ones who hire the police officers. They're the ones who staff the garrisons around and inside the city. And there are a fair few little wars going on between the various trade houses, well, of course. And the guilds, and the criminal organizations, and the pirates, and everybody else for that matter. For the common people, Marienburg has seen better times. For the wealthy merchant class, oh, it's better than ever. Business is not merely booming, it is exploding. Free of tariffs and regulations and pretty much any and all central government and command, the merchants simply do whatever it is they need to do to earn money, which Marienburg has absolute oceans of, being able to outfit a vast, well-equipped standing army. They even at one point bought steam tanks from Newland and the now infamous Marienburg land ships. Not to mention their navy is the envy of the old world, employing the finest of recent technology, both in terms of cannons and shipbuilding. For all intents and purposes, Marienburg has become a power in its own rights that could probably stand up to any unfocused, at least, conquest by local powers. And even if it could not, Marienburg has managed to place itself in a rather brilliant position, where everyone wants it, Bretonnia wants it, the Empire wants it, hell, Chileans, Castilians, and Elves might be interested in it as well. So that if any power makes a move on it, the others will rush to Marienburg's defense, simply to maintain this relatively open and free port, and to deny it to anybody else. It doesn't look like Marienburg is going to be returning to the Empire anytime soon. And the only thing that could bring it low would be the very thing that allowed it to rise to such a lofty place in the first place. Enormous administrative neglect. And for some reason, I imagine that the Marienburg merchants learned their lesson very, very well when they managed to secede from the Empire with little more than the power of their pocketbooks. Until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.